I lived my life by 3 rules. Never let a stranger in, never lose control, and never ever let anyone touch the marble. I was the Ice King of Manhattan, a man who preferred contracts over connections. Then, a blizzard, a burst pipe, and a favor I couldn't refuse dropped Leo into my living room. He didn't just bring a broken suitcase, he brought a whirlwind of color that threatened to melt everything I had spent 15 years building. He was a chaotic artist who smelled like turpentine and rebellion. I was a senior partner who didn't know how to breathe without a schedule. We were supposed to be roommates for a week. We were supposed to stay on our own sides of the hallway. But when the lights went out and the city froze over, I realized that the only thing more dangerous than the storm outside was the heat of the man standing in my kitchen. Everyone thinks they want a perfect life, but tonight I'm going to tell you the story of how I lost my reputation and finally found my soul. This is Gay Stories Chronicles. The silence in Julian's apartment wasn't just a lack of noise, it was a curated achievement. It was the kind of silence that cost $12,000 a month in HOA fees and required triple-paned, soundproof glass that looked out over the glittering, uncaring spine of Manhattan. Julian stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of amber scotch in hand, watching the snow begin to swirl around the spire of the Chrysler Building. He loved this time of day, the transition from the frantic energy of the firm to the absolute, unyielding control of his home. Everything in Julian's life had a place. The books on his shelves were alphabetized by author, their spines aligned with the edge of the mahogany wood. His kitchen was a temple of stainless steel and white marble, devoid of crumbs, fingerprints, or life. He was 38, a senior partner, and a man who had successfully scrubbed every trace of uncertainty from his existence. Then his phone vibrated on the marble island. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. It was Elias, his mentor, the man who had plucked Julian out of a mid-tier law school and taught him how to bleed his opponents dry in a boardroom. But Elias had a weakness. He loved art, and more specifically, he loved artists. Julian, Elias's voice was strained, competing with the sound of rushing water in the background. It's a catastrophe. A water main burst in the building above the gallery. My storage unit, the studio, it's all under 6 inches of gray sludge. Julian tightened his grip on his glass. I'm sorry to hear that, Elias. Call the insurance adjusters. I can send you names of a few who owe me favors. No, it's not the insurance. It's Leo, Elias sighed. He was living in the studio space while he prepared for the winter gala. Everything he owns is soaked. He has nowhere to go, Julian. The hotels are booked solid because of the storm and the conference. I'm stuck in Connecticut because the trains are down. I need you to take him in, just for the week. Julian felt a cold prickle of dread. Elias, I don't do guests. My apartment isn't set up for people. He's a genius, Julian, and he's my godson. Please. He's already in an Uber heading your way. Don't let him freeze on the sidewalk. The line went dead. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Julian straightened his charcoal cashmere sweater, took a breath, and opened the door. He wasn't prepared for the visual assault. Leo didn't look like a genius. He looked like a disaster. He was leaning against the doorframe, soaked to the bone, wearing a vintage, oversized faux fur coat that looked like it had been salvaged from a dumpster in the 70s. Underneath, he wore paint-splattered overalls and a t-shirt that said, "I'm not lazy, I'm buffered." His hair was a wild, wet thicket of dark curls that dripped onto Julian's polished hallway floor. In one hand, he clutched a neon-pink suitcase with a broken wheel. In the other, a wooden crate filled with smelling canisters of turpentine and oil paints. "You must be the Ice King," Leo said, his voice a gravelly, warm baritone that seemed to vibrate in the small hallway. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, trailing a path of slush and mud. Elias said you were uptight, but he didn't mention the jawline. Nice place. A bit mortgage, but we can fix that. Julian stared at the muddy footprints on his white oak floors. He felt a vein in his temple begin to throb. It's not mortgage, it's minimalist. And you are, Leo? In the flesh. Mostly cold, wet flesh right now, Leo said, dropping the pink suitcase. The broken wheel gave out entirely, and the bag slumped over like a dying animal. Leo looked around, his eyes landing on a minimalist charcoal sketch Julian had bought for $10,000. Oof, who told you that was art? That's just a depressed scribble. We're definitely going to need to bring some color in here. You aren't bringing anything in here, Julian said, his voice dropping to that dangerous, quiet register he used in court. You are a guest of Elias. You will stay in the second bedroom. You will not touch the thermostat. You will not use the kitchen for anything that involves heavy spices. And for the love of God, you will stay away from the walls with those paints. Leo just laughed. It was a rich, genuine sound that seemed to bounce off the cold surfaces of the room. He walked up to Julian, stepping well into his personal space. Julian could smell him now, a mix of rain, expensive cigars, and the sharp chemical tang of linseed oil. Rule number 1 of art, Julian, Leo whispered, leaning in just close enough that Julian could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. You can't have a masterpiece without a little mess. He winked, picked up his crate, and headed toward the guest room as if he owned the place. Julian stood in his pristine living room, watching a single dark drop of mud slowly soak into the grain of his expensive wood floor. He realized with a sinking feeling that the silence he had spent a decade building was officially dead. The first night was a tactical nightmare. Julian lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, ears straining. Usually, the only sound was the faint hum of the climate control system. Now, through the thick walls, he heard the muffled thud of Leo moving furniture. Then the unmistakable scent of burnt garlic and rosemary began to drift under his bedroom door. Julian looked at his clock. 1:15 a.m. He threw off his duvet, marched into the kitchen, and stopped dead. Leo had not just used the kitchen, he had colonized it. Every burner on the stove was active, a cast-iron skillet was smoking, and Leo was standing there, barefoot, wearing nothing but a pair of low-slung gray sweatpants, humming a jazz tune while he chopped herbs with a ferocity that made Julian fear for his countertops. "What are you doing?" Julian hissed. "This is a residence, not a bistro." Leo didn't even turn around. He flicked a pinch of salt into the pan with a flourish. "I don't eat when I'm stressed, Julian. I cook. And after seeing that soulless refrigerator of yours, honestly, 3 types of mustard and a bottle of alkaline water, I figured I was doing us both a favor." "I don't want a favor. I want to sleep," Julian replied, but his eyes betrayed him. He couldn't help but notice the way the muscles in Leo's back moved as he worked. Leo's skin was a map of his life, scars from old accidents, a smudge of cobalt blue paint on his shoulder blade, and a vitality that made the sterile kitchen feel suddenly uncomfortably small. Leo turned then, holding out a wooden spoon. "Taste this." "I am not tasting. Taste it, or I start singing loudly. I know the entire score of Les Miserables, and I have terrible pitch when I'm tired." Julian sighed, stepped forward, and allowed Leo to press the spoon to his lips. The flavor was explosive, rich, spicy, and deeply comforting. It was the complete opposite of Julian's life. It was messy and brilliant. "Good, right?" Leo grinned. The light from the oven hood caught the stubble on his jaw. For a second, the air between them changed. The Ice King persona Julian wore like armor felt heavy, and the way Leo was looking at him, not with fear, but with an intense, curious heat, made Julian's pulse skip. "It's acceptable," Julian managed, stepping back into the shadows of the hallway. "Clean up when you're done. every single spot. The next morning was worse. Julian woke up at his usual 5 a.m. expecting his quiet ritual. Instead, he found the living room transformed. Leo had moved the $20,000 Italian leather sofa to the window to catch the morning light. Large canvases, still damp with primer, were leaning against the walls. The smell of coffee, real, strong, dark coffee, replaced the sterile scent of his air purifier. Julian found Leo asleep on the floor, curled up among his sketches like a cat. He looked younger when he was asleep, the bravado gone, leaving behind only the raw exhaustion of a man who had lost his home. Julian picked up a stray sketchbook that had fallen open. He expected to see abstract shapes or chaotic splatters. Instead, he saw himself. It was a charcoal study of Julian standing by the window from the night before. Leo had captured the exact tension in Julian's shoulders, the loneliness in the way he held his glass, and the sharp, defensive line of his jaw. It wasn't a depressed scribble. It was the most honest thing Julian had seen in years. It was a mirror. He felt a surge of anger. How dare this stranger see him so clearly, mixed with a terrifying sense of being known. He slammed the book shut, the sound waking Leo instantly. Leo sat up, rubbing his eyes, completely unfazed by Julian's towering rage. "Morning, sunshine? You're early. Coffee's in the pot. I used the expensive beans you were hiding in the back." "You have no respect for boundaries," Julian whispered, his hands trembling slightly. "You move my furniture, you use my kitchen, and you draw me without permission?" Julian stood up, stretching his arms over his head, his shirt riding up to reveal the lean line of his waist. He walked right up to Julian until they were inches apart. Julian didn't move. He couldn't. "I draw what interests me, Julian," Leo said, his voice low and morning rough. "And right now, you're the most interesting thing in this city. You're a masterpiece hidden under a layer of dust. I'm just trying to see what's underneath." Julian's breath hitched. He wanted to scream at him to leave. He wanted to call Elias and demand a hotel. But instead, he looked into Leo's eyes and felt the first cracks in his marble walls. "Stay out of my room, Leo," Julian said, his voice lacking its usual bite. "No promises," Leo whispered back, a challenge dancing in his eyes. By the second afternoon, the storm had transformed from a nuisance into a historical event. The Ice King's fortress was officially under siege, not by the wind rattling the triple-paned glass, but by the sheer, unadulterated energy of the man in the guest room. Manhattan was a ghost of white and gray outside, but inside the penthouse the colors were becoming vivid, almost violent. Julian attempted to maintain his professional dignity. He sat in his home office, a room designed like a sensory deprivation tank, trying to focus on a merger agreement for a global logistics firm. But the silence he relied on was gone. From the living room came the rhythmic shuck-shuck of a palette knife scraping against canvas, followed by the low, soulful hum of a Nina Simone record Leo had found in Julian's Vintage for Show collection. Every time Julian tried to read a clause, Leo's laugh would punctuate the air, usually because he was on the phone with a fellow artist, speaking in a rapid-fire mix of Italian and English about tonal values and emotional honesty. Finally, Julian snapped. He stormed out of his office, his silk tie loosened, his hair, usually a perfect silver-black sweep, slightly mussed from his constant pacing. "Leo, this is not a studio. I have $1 billion deal on my desk, and I can't think over the sound of whatever it is you're doing to my floor." Leo was hunched over a massive canvas, his face streaked with a smudge of ochre. He didn't look up. "I'm giving your apartment a soul, Julian. It's a grueling process, very loud, very messy. I don't want a soul. I want a quiet living room." Leo finally paused, his brush hovering inches from the canvas. He turned his head slowly, looking at Julian with an expression that wasn't mocking for once. It was clinical, observational. "You know you're vibrating. You're like a guitar string tuned so tight that the slightest touch is going to make you snap. Why are you so afraid of noise? Or is it just that you're afraid of what you might hear if things get quiet?" Julian felt the heat rise to his face. It wasn't just anger. It was the uncomfortable sensation of being dissected. "I am not vibrating. I am a professional who values order." "Order is just a polite word for a cage," Leo said. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag that was more paint than fabric. He walked toward Julian, his movements fluid and feline. Julian found himself backing up until his heels hit the edge of the kitchen island. Leo didn't stop until he was in Julian's space, the danger zone that Julian usually guarded with a glare. Leo reached out, his hand stopping just short of Julian's chest. "Your heart is racing. I can see it in your throat." "It's the caffeine," Julian lied, his voice sounding thin even to his own ears. "It's not the coffee," whispered Leo. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the same static that preceded a lightning strike. Leo's eyes dropped to Julian's mouth for a fraction of a second, a look so deliberate it felt like a touch. "You've spent so long pretending you're a statue that you've forgotten what it feels like to be made of skin and bone." Before Julian could respond, the lights flickered. A low groan vibrated through the building, and then total darkness. The hum of the climate control died. The Nina Simone record slurred to a stop. The only light came from the blue-white reflection of the snow against the windows. "Well," Leo's voice came out of the dark, sounding closer than before. "Looks like the universe decided you've worked enough for today." "The backup generators should kick in," Julian said, though he didn't move. He was terrified that if he reached out, he would find Leo's chest instead of the marble counter. "They won't. I saw the maintenance guy earlier. Something about a flooded basement and a short circuit," Leo lied. Or perhaps he didn't. Julian couldn't tell. "Looks like it's just us, the Ice King and the Chaos Artist, trapped in a cold palace." Julian felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. "I have candles in the pantry, emergency kits." "Forget the candles," Leo said. Julian heard the sound of a match striking. A small orange flame bloomed between them, illuminating Leo's face. He looked like something out of a Caravaggio painting. Deep shadows, sharp highlights, and an intensity that was almost frightening. "Let's see if we can find something more interesting to burn." He lit a single thick candle on the island and looked at Julian. In the flickering light, Julian just looked like a man, vulnerable, confused, and dangerously close to a precipice. "I'm going to make a fire in that decorative fireplace of yours, and you're going to open a bottle of that wine you've been saving for a special occasion. Because, Julian, look outside. The world is stopping. This is the occasion." Julian watched him walk away into the shadows of the living room. He should have been annoyed. He should have been worried about the soot. But as he reached for a bottle of vintage Bordeaux, his hands were still shaking. He realized with a jolt of terror that he didn't want the lights to come back on. He didn't want the world to start moving again. Because for the first time in 15 years, Julian felt like he was waking up. The fire wasn't just a source of heat. It was a revelation. Julian's fireplace had been designed by a minimalist architect to be visually clean, a gas-powered flame behind tempered glass that produced no scent and no ash. But Leo had bypassed the gas line. He had found a crate of reclaimed cedar wood Julian had bought for a rustic aesthetic years ago and actually lit it. The smell of wood smoke began to permeate the $15 million penthouse, a scent so primal and ancient that it felt like an act of rebellion against the high-tech surroundings. Julian sat on the floor, something he hadn't done since law school, clutching a glass of Bordeaux that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Leo was sitting cross-legged across from him, the firelight dancing in the curls of his hair and casting long, flickering shadows against the canvases that lined the walls. The chaos artist was silent for once, staring into the embers with a look of profound melancholy that Julian hadn't seen before. "You doing it again?" Leo said softly, not breaking his gaze from the fire. "Doing what?" Julian asked, his voice sounding raspy in the dry air. "Analyzing, weighing the pros and cons of sitting on your own floor, wondering if the smoke is going to stain the ceiling." Leo finally looked up, and the intensity in his eyes was enough to make Julian look away. "Just be here, Julian. The firm doesn't exist tonight. The Ice King is out of office." Julian took a long swallow of the wine. The heat of the alcohol spread through his chest, loosening the knot that had been tied tight for a decade. "It's not that easy to just be here. I spent my whole life building a version of myself that wouldn't get hurt, a version that was untouchable." "And how's that working out for you?" Leo asked, leaning forward. "You're untouchable, sure, but that also means you haven't been touched. Not really, not in the way that matters." Julian felt the sting of the truth. He thought about the men he'd dated over the years, other lawyers, bankers, men who were as polished and hollow as he was. They were arrangements more than relationships, quick dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, polite conversation about the market, and sex that was efficient but lacked the heat of a real connection.
"I thought I was happy," Julian whispered. It was the first time he'd said it out loud. "Happiness isn't a spreadsheet, Julian," Leo said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. He crawled a few inches closer on the rug. The space between them was shrinking. "Happiness is the mess. It's the paint under your fingernails. It's the fear you feel when you look at someone and realize they can see right through you." Leo reached out. It wasn't a sudden movement. It was slow, giving Julian every chance to flinch or pull away. He didn't. Leo's hand, calloused and warm, came to rest on Julian's cheek. His thumb traced the line of Julian's jaw, moving over the skin with a reverence that made Julian's eyes flutter shut. "Your skin is so cold," Leo murmured. "Let me warm you up." Julian's breath hitched. He knew he should stand up. He should make a joke, break the tension, and go back to his cold, perfect bedroom. But for the first time in his life, the rules felt like a prison he was ready to escape. He leaned into the touch, his own hand coming up to wrap around Leo's wrist. The contact was electric. It wasn't the polite, measured touch Julian was used to. It was raw. It was the smell of cedar and wine and the heat of the fireplace. "Leo," Julian breathed, his voice a warning and a plea all at once. "I know," Leo whispered. He didn't move away. Instead, he moved closer, until their knees were touching, until Julian could feel the heat radiating off Leo's body. "I've been wanting to do this since the moment you opened that door and looked at me like I was a smudge on your perfect floor. I hated you for that," Julian admitted, a small, shaky smile breaking through his reserve. "You didn't," Leo countered, his eyes locked on Julian's lips. "You hated that I made you feel something. And Julian, you're feeling it now, aren't you?" Julian didn't answer with words. He couldn't. He reached out and grabbed the front of Leo's paint-stained t-shirt, pulling him forward. The kiss wasn't a beginning. It was a collision. It was 10 years of suppressed desire and cold marble crashing into a world of color and fire. It was desperate and messy, the taste of wine and the heat of the fireplace mingling between them. Julian groaned into Leo's mouth, his hands tangling in those wild curls he'd spent 2 days pretending to ignore. In that moment, the high-rise, the billion-dollar deals, and the Ice King persona vanished. There was only the fire, the storm outside, and the man who would finally taught Julian how to burn.
The kiss didn't end so much as it transformed. It slowed down, becoming a conversation of breath and skin. They eventually pulled apart just enough to rest their foreheads together, both of them breathing as if they had just run a marathon through the snow-clogged streets below.
The fire was dying down to a deep, pulsing orange, casting a glow that made the room feel like a sanctuary at the edge of the world. "I think," Julian whispered, his voice trembling with a vulnerability he hadn't felt since he was a child, "that I may have underestimated the mess you talked about." Leo let out a soft, huffed laugh, his fingers still tracing the back of Julian's neck, playing with the short hairs there. "The mess is where the truth lives, Julian. Everything else is just staging." They stayed on the floor, leaning against the base of the sofa that Leo had moved. Julian found himself tucked into the crook of Leo's arm, a position that should have felt undignified for a man of his stature, but instead felt like the only right thing in the world. The coldness of the penthouse was being pushed back by the heat of their bodies. "Tell me something real," Leo said, his voice a low vibration against Julian's ear. "Not a resume, not a list of cases won. Tell me about the boy who lived before he decided to become a statue." Julian was silent for a long time. He watched a single ember pop and drift up the chimney. "I grew up in a house where everything had to be perfect because my father's temper was the only thing that wasn't. If the shoes weren't lined up, if the grades weren't top of the class, the ice would descend. I learned very early that if I was perfect, I was safe. If I was quiet, I couldn't be broken." He felt Leo's grip tighten slightly, a silent gesture of support. "I went to law school because it was a world of logic, black and white, precedent and procedure. I thought if I built a life that was entirely logical, I'd never have to feel that kind of chaos again. But then you walked in, with that pink suitcase and mud on your boots, and you reminded me that I've just been holding my breath for 20 years. Leo shifted so he could look Julian in the eye. The playful bravado was gone from the artist's face, replaced by a raw, naked sincerity. "I grew up the opposite way. My parents were travelers. No roots, no rules, just a lot of love and a lot of uncertainty. I learned that the only thing you can count on is the feeling you have in the moment. When the gallery flooded, I wasn't just losing my studio, Julian. I was losing my anchor. I act like I don't care about the chaos, but I do. I spend every day trying to capture something permanent on a canvas because I'm terrified that everything is just passing through." "Even this?" Julian asked, the word catching in his throat. "Are you just passing through?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the smoke. The week-long arrangement suddenly felt like a ticking clock. In 5 days, the storm would be over. The gallery would be cleaned. The Ice King would have to go back to his meetings, and the chaos artist would go back to his world of color and movement. Leo reached out and took Julian's hand, interlacing their fingers. "I don't know, Julian. I've never been good at looking at the horizon. I'm an impressionist. I look at the light right now, and right now, the light is beautiful." They spent the rest of the night talking in a way Julian didn't know men could talk. They didn't talk about sports or politics or money. They talked about fears. They talked about the art Julian used to sketch in the margins of his notebooks when he was a boy. They talked about the way the light looks in Tuscany in July. At some point, the exhaustion of the emotional upheaval caught up with them. They didn't move to the bedroom. They stayed right there on the rug, wrapped in a plush wool blanket Julian had bought for aesthetic texture, but was finally using for its actual purpose. As Julian drifted off to sleep, his head resting on Leo's chest, he heard the steady rhythmic beat of Leo's heart. It was a sound more powerful than any legal argument, more complex than any contract. It was the sound of a life being lived. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Julian wasn't afraid of the morning. He was only afraid of the day the guest room would be empty again. The following 48 hours were a blur of domestic defiance. The power returned on Sunday morning with a sudden, jarring hum of the refrigerator and a burst of light from the overhead LEDs, but for Julian and Leo, the
outside world remained a distant rumor. The city was still digging itself out, and the usual Sunday morning rush of brunch and busyness felt like a memory from another life. In the kitchen, the dynamic had shifted from a battleground to a dance. Julian, who usually viewed food as a utilitarian necessity, found himself standing at the counter, sleeves rolled up, under Leo's tutelage. "You're overthinking the tomato, Julian," Leo laughed, leaning over Julian's shoulder. His chest pressed against Julian's back, a casual intimacy that made Julian's skin tingle. "It's a fruit, not a witness you're trying to cross-examine. Just slice it. Let it be imperfect." "I'm a lawyer, Leo. Imperfection is a liability." "In law, maybe. In life, it's the seasoning." He reached around, his hand covering Julian's on the knife handle. He guided the blade through the tomato, the juice splattering across the pristine white marble. For the first time, Julian didn't reach for a paper towel. He just looked at Leo's hand, strong, paint-stained and warm, and felt a wave of contentment so sharp it was almost painful. They ate on the balcony, wrapped in heavy coats, watching the city begin to stir below. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the easy conversation of two people who had skipped the small talk and gone straight to the soul. But as the sun began to set on Monday, the reality of the calendar began to weigh on the room. Julian's phone, which he had kept on Do Not Disturb for 48 hours, was a minefield of missed calls and urgent emails. The Ice King was being summoned back to his throne. "The gala is Wednesday night," Leo said quietly, staring out at the skyline. He was sketching again, but his strokes were frantic, less focused than they had been during the storm. "Elias called. The gallery is dry. The restoration team is moving the pieces back in tomorrow morning." Julian felt a cold lump form in his stomach. "Tomorrow?"
"Yeah," Leo said, finally putting down his charcoal. He didn't look at Julian. "I should probably start packing the pink suitcase. The wheel is still broken, but I think I can make it to the curb." The playful tone was gone. The apartment, which had felt so vibrant and full of life for 3 days, suddenly felt like a stage set being struck after the final curtain. Julian looked at the canvases leaning against his walls, vibrant explosions of color that had permanently altered the energy of his home. He looked at the spot on the rug where they had shared their first kiss. He realized with a terrifying clarity that when Leo left, he wasn't just losing a roommate, he was losing the person who had turned the lights back on in his life. "Leo," Julian started, his voice cracking. "Don't," whispered Leo, finally turning to face him. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We knew what this was, Julian. A beautiful accident. A storm that blew us into the same room. But you have your firm, and I have my road. We're from different palettes, remember?" "I don't care about the palette," Julian snapped, stepping toward him. "I care about the man. I care about how I feel when I wake up and hear you humming in the kitchen. I care that I don't want this silence back." Leo reached out, cupping Julian's face with both hands. It was a gesture of goodbye, and they both knew it. "Then come to the gala Wednesday night. See me in my world, and then we'll see if the Ice King can survive the heat of a real Manhattan Wednesday." He kissed Julian then, a soft, lingering taste of salt and sorrow, and for the first time, the minimalist apartment felt absolutely, devastatingly empty. The 48 hours after Leo left were the longest of Julian's life. The penthouse was technically perfect again. A professional cleaning crew had come in and erased every trace of the chaos artist. The mud was gone. The smell of wood smoke had been neutralized by industrial-grade air purifiers. The furniture was back in its mathematically precise alignment. But as Julian stood in the center of his living room on Tuesday night, he didn't feel relief. He felt like he was standing in a tomb. He tried to work. He sat at his desk and stared at the merger documents, but the words blurred. Every time he looked at the white walls, he saw the ghost of the vibrant canvases that had leaned there.
Every time he walked into the kitchen, he expected to smell burnt rosemary, only to be met with the sterile scent of stainless steel. He realized then that you can't unknow a feeling. He had been content with his silence before because he didn't know what music sounded like. Now the silence was deafening. Wednesday evening arrived with the kind of biting cold that New York saves for its most elite events. Julian stood before his mirror, tying his bow tie. He looked exactly like the man the world expected him to be, powerful, polished, and impenetrable. But as he looked into his own eyes, he saw the man Leo had sketched in the dark, the man who was vibrating with a need for something more than a career. The gala was held at a massive converted warehouse in Chelsea. It was the who's who of the Manhattan art and legal worlds. As Julian stepped out of his black car, he felt the familiar weight of his professional mask settling over his face. He shook hands with judges, chatted with billionaire developers, and accepted compliments on his recent court victories, but his eyes were scanning the room. He found Leo in the center of the main hall, surrounded by a crowd of admirers. Leo looked different, and yet exactly the same. He was wearing a velvet suit the color of a midnight bruise, his curls tamed but still rebellious. He was glowing. This was his element. He was talking with his hands, his eyes bright with the same fire Julian had seen in his kitchen. When Leo saw Julian across the room, the conversation around him seemed to fade into a blur. For a long, breathless moment, they just looked at each other, the Ice King in his tuxedo and the chaos artist in his velvet. Julian approached him, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "The show is incredible, Leo. The critics are already calling it a career-defining moment." Leo stepped away from his circle, drawing Julian into a quieter corner behind a large sculpture. "I didn't think you'd come," Leo whispered. He looked exhausted, but happy. "I thought maybe once the power came back on, you'd decide the storm was just a dream." "I tried," Julian admitted, his voice low and raw. "I tried to go back to the way things were. I cleaned the apartment, I went to the meetings, I did everything right. But Leo, the silence is broken. I can't live in that morgue anymore." Leo's expression softened, a look of profound hope dawning in his eyes. "So, what are you saying, Julian? This isn't a penthouse in a blizzard. This is the real world. There are cameras, there are reputations, there are rules." Julian looked around the room, at the partners from his firm, the clients who expected him to be a statue, and the high society life he had spent 15 years building. Then he looked at Leo. He looked at the man who had seen his soul in a charcoal sketch. "I'm saying that I'd rather be a mess with you than a masterpiece alone." In front of the critics, the billionaires, and the Ice King's entire professional world, Julian reached out. He didn't just shake Leo's hand. He took Leo's face in both of his hands, just as Leo had done to him, and kissed him. It wasn't a polite kiss. It was the sound of a wall crumbling. It was the declaration of a man who had finally chosen love over his reputation. The room went quiet, then began to buzz with the frantic energy of 100 whispers. Julian didn't care. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about the precedent or the procedure. He was only thinking about the heat of Leo's skin and the way his own heart felt, finally, undeniably alive. "Let's go home," Leo whispered against his lips, a tear tracing a path through the faint smudge of paint on his cheek. "Not home," Julian corrected, a smile breaking across his face like the first day of spring. "Let's go find a place where we can make a new mess, together." Julian spent his life building a fortress, thinking that safety was found in the absence of chaos. But as he learned, a house that is too clean is just a waiting room for a life that hasn't started yet. We often spend our years protecting a reputation that doesn't love us back, afraid that if we show a little color, the world will judge us. But the truth is, the people who matter will love you for your mess, not your perfection. If this story touched a part of you that's been feeling a little too quiet lately, I want to thank you for listening. These stories live and breathe because of you, because of your comments, your 10 out of 10 ratings, and your willingness to believe in love against all odds. If you want to stay a part of this journey, please consider subscribing to Gay Stories Chronicles. Join our community where every heart has a home and no one has to be a statue alone. And I'll see you in the next story. Until then, don't be afraid to make a little mess. Love is always worth the cleanup.